Welcome to the Media Roundtable. We're talking to leading voices in podcasts about what they create, why they create it, and the impact that they want it to have on the world. Whether you're a member of the media or the marketing community, or you're a podcast listener who just cares about the direction of this country and the messages that you want to advance, we want to help you feel good about what you consume, what you distribute, and what you support. I'm your host, Dan Granger, and today we're joined by a very special gentleman named Joey Dumont. Joey is the former managing director of Questus and was a self-proclaimed douchebag. That's correct. You heard that accurately. After a successful career in the advertising business, something Joey and I share, we'll see about the rest, Joey wrote a self-deprecating memoir called Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag, and launched True 30, a journalistic platform which discusses and debates our society's most politically compelling topics through the lens of slow journalism. I think you're going to hear some familiar themes, but maybe a different slant on some of them today, and definitely excited to talk about what is and the importance of slow journalism. Joey is also the host of a podcast called Laugh Your Cry Out. Joey, welcome to the Media Roundtable.
Thank you, Dan. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you. One other thing the audience should know is that if you're just listening and not watching this on YouTube, you've dressed me under the table. You came impeccably, you're immaculate, dressed to the nines. And I had to go change my shirt just to at least be on the same Zoom with you and not embarrass myself. So I'm glad that you're here.
Thank you.
Let's start with the advertising piece. So,
Sure.
So you were in the business for the bulk of your career. Can you just give us a little bio and background on the first leg of your professional journey before you got into the more content generation side?
Yeah, I actually spent 20 years in digital advertising, the last 10 of which I was a managing director and partner at an agency called Questus, which I think you talked about. We won Ad Agency of the Year in 2011, 2012. And we shot a documentary called The Naked Brand, which was our exploration of how social technology was going to affect brand communication moving forward.
What year was that, you said?
2012 is when we launched that.
2012, you did the documentary.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. What did you predict and how close were you?
It's funny that and please let me give credit where credit is due. My business partner at the time, Jeff Rosenblum, was the writer and director, and it was his baby. I was just the executive producer, but the idea behind it was that because we have supercomputers in our pockets and purses today, that brands have to start to be more transparent about their supply chain, about their sourcing, where they go. One of the actual guys that we featured was Yvon Chouinard, which is the CEO and founder of Patagonia. And he started something at the time that was called the Footprint Chronicles. And in that, in 2007, you would jump onto their website, you could push in a SKU number of your jacket, and it would show you where the jacket was sourced, sewn up, flown over the pond, and the carbon footprint that went along with that. And that was his approach to saying, hey, I just want you to know everything we're doing. Oh, and by the way, the chemicals we used on that jacket are deleterious to planet Earth, and here's why. But we don't have another chemical that keeps the water from absorbing in your jacket. And so if all you guys out there have any suggestions, please let us know. And so the idea behind the movie was that, hey, is this going to change brands moving forward? Are they going to be more transparent about all of these things, their supply chains, their sourcing, their team, their diversity, all of that? And much of it we got right. I think that sadly, I thought it would be more based on the fact that we do have these computers in our pockets, but obviously there's still a lot of subterfuge within corporate America and people not telling the truth and those kind of things. But it wasn't a Pollyanna approach. I think that Jeff, my old partner, his vision on that was accurate. And I think actually the movie today is more relevant than it was a decade ago.
Well, certainly more people have caught on to that idea. And it's, I mean, I think it's impressive looking back a decade and thinking in those terms, because, you know, the big thing we talk about a lot on here is when the business roundtable shifted from shareholder capitalism as the defined purpose of a corporation to stakeholder capitalism. But it seems like you guys were pretty well ahead of the curve. I wonder how many people were even thinking about supply chain compared to what's going on now and the accountability around that. one, to make a more specific question about it, you were in advertising. I am in advertising. Our day job here is that we have an agency called Oxford Road. And we have seen, I think one of the biggest shifts we've seen in the last decade is that it didn't happen at the same time that people started really paying attention to what their products were made out of. But I think that the same rules are starting to apply, not just for how you created your widget, but also who are you talking to and how are you talking to them about that widget. And I don't even think the right term has been invented yet, but like, what is the supply chain of communication, and how long do you think there has been accountability or expectations around how people market as a reflection of who they are as a brand?
Well, that was part and parcel to the thesis, is that
he actually made that link in that documentary.
Yeah, he tried to talk to the fact. He said to us, I think that the future of advertising is telling the truth about truthful companies versus historical advertising, which was creating a narrative about a great company and why they're great. And the question is, are they really great? And what the idea behind the thesis was originally was that, hey, if you're lying about something, if you have a supply chain in China that has slave labor as an example, and you do not figure that out, if that's your responsibility, and you need to do that. And we highlighted Nike and what they went through in the documentary and how they actually reformatted a lot of their governance specific to that. And there's a lot of other companies that were doing the same thing. We interviewed Kevin Plank from Under Armour, and we interviewed Keith Weed from Unilever. There was a lot of really big responsible people. And I mean responsible in that sense, because Unilever is really big into responsible brands and what they're doing around sustainability, environmental friendly. Is it socially responsible? They were, I think, a pioneer in that space quite a while ago. And so that's a lot of the companies that we featured. And the idea to me was that you really do need to be it. And Shaquille O'Neal was also in the documentary. And he actually said, when he was being represented by the suits, he said, they came and told me, this is who you need to be. This is how you need to act. This is how you need to speak. And he said, no. I'm me. I'm going to say what I want to say. I'm going to say what I believe. I need to be authentic. And if I'm not authentic, no one's going to believe me. And I think that really encapsulated what we were attempting to do within the macro narrative of the documentary. But I also believe that that's where companies need to get. And when you actually do start to, let's just say that you're a company that doesn't have a lot to do with environmentalism, because that was Yvon Chouinard's whole purpose. He started the company so that he'd have a soapbox to preach environmentalism. That's who he is. And he lets his staff go out and surf during high tide. He cares about this planet. And so that's why I think the messaging worked specific to Patagonia. If you're a big company and you want to own a purpose, as an example, but it's not authentic, I think consumers can see that and feel that. And that can actually be harmful to your brand as opposed to helpful.
How readily available are report cards on, let's just say, publicly traded companies or large companies? How much knowledge do we actually have about their participation in these types of issues by now? Do we know who is employing slave labor to manufacture their products? Is that all out in the open? Does everybody know?
Well, I think that's what I mentioned. I thought that would just go away based on the fact that you knew it could be unearthed, but it still happens. It still happens. I actually had a client when we were promoting the documentary, and I don't want to get into who it was, but he said to me, you guys need to calm down on this. And he said, we have a supplier that's doing X, Y, and Z, and it's not good. And I was like, Bob, if it's not good, you need to fix it now, dude, because you're either someone's going to out you. And then when they out you, you need to hire Edelman just to go through the disaster recovery and figure that all out. And that's not only going to be costly, it's going to be really damaging to your brand. And so, I wish companies were out there saying that there's no bad going on anymore, but that's just not the case.
Well, okay, but I guess I'm at that's interesting answer. I'm asking a different question. The question I'm asking is it all public record?
Oh.
Is there a database that shows which brands are the bad actors?
Answer. It's a great question. I don't have an answer to that. As far as the compliance, is it basically who is the governing body of all publicly traded companies and where does that sit? where do CSR programs sit within that? That's a question that's way above my pay grade, Dan.
Or it's the next company we're going to start.
Yeah.
Anyway. So, okay, that's interesting. So on the advertising side, we just saw a tremendous shift, particularly in the last few years of like, especially around influencers,
Yeah.
where brands are increasingly sensitive and I think increasingly vulnerable to the associations that they have with what talent they align themselves with. So maybe maybe some of this was going on before, but like in 2012, for example, most of our businesses focus on podcasts. There was no podcast industry to speak of in 2012 that anybody paid attention to. I wonder how much that has shifted and how how brands are changing their view of what alliances they make with influencers across all different platforms. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on the brand. When we worked with big banks, as an example, or Disney or Universal or any of the larger brands, they're very concerned about not only where your media is placed, who your influencers are, but then if they happen to have a bad reputation, or let's just say something bad happens, a big racist comment, or they find out, the Jesse Smollett, as an example, if that young man was, your influencer, obviously that's going to be a problem.
That might be problematic. Yeah.
Yeah. So, again, I've been out of the industry now for 5 years. So it's been one of those things where influencers were kind of the up and coming thing. We used to call them bloggers, and we used to call them, people that wrote or that had some kind of social media influence, but we didn't actually have the moniker of influencer.
Thank you for that ancient history lesson. Yes. Back when we used to have these
back in
bloggers.
Well, it is funny because being out of the industry for the last 4 years it's a big delta. I've missed out on a lot. Yeah. And I knew that from being in the industry for 20 years. We used to make the joke that if you took a sabbatical for 3 months, you'd come back and you wouldn't even understand the vernacular, right? Or you'd miss out on the new acronyms. But, I should have prefaced that with you. I'm not up to speed on a lot of what's going on specific to marketing and influencers and a lot of the nuance there.
Fair enough. Why'd you get out?
I originally got out because I wanted to write my memoir. I have 2 little boys, and I had a less than optimal upbringing, to be candid. And so I wanted to write it for them. And I planned on taking a year or 2 off just because I had a really wonderful run in the business. And I wanted to take some time off and coach my kids' teams and be a present dad, because I didn't have that as a child. And then based on I guess more of the perfectionism, I could not get the story to gel. And it took me 4 years to write it. I brought my brother in to help me clean it up. My brother is a rhetorician and a law professor and a thinker. And I said, Paul, my brother, I need help. He said, yes, you do. So he sat with me on the couch every weekend and explained to me, he would say, hey, look, let's take out the to be verb here. And let's make an absolute phrase out of this. And look at how beautiful this sentence is now. And look at how beautiful this paragraph is now. And I was like, wow, that's so much better. And, we spent a couple years going back and forth to clean up the actual memoir. And because he was my brother and he experienced the same, obviously same life with my father and my stepfather and all the pieces and parts that we wrote about, it was actually really cool to collaborate with him on. And so it took a lot longer. And then my wife said one day, are you ever going to go back to work? I said, yeah, I think I should. And so in January of 2022, that's when we launched True 30.
Wow. Well, before we get to True 30, we will get there. It's important stuff. But I do want to get into this, what you were just alluding to, your first book, Joey Somebody, The Life and Times of a Recovering Douchebag. Now, I've met people that one might describe as a douchebag. I've met people that identify themselves in all kinds of different ways. I've never met anybody that self-proclaims that they are a douchebag. So care to start there, and then we can go through maybe some of the key themes from the book.
Yeah.
How did you get to that place?
I think specifically, we defined douchebaggery in the opening prologue. I was driving through San Francisco in my overpriced car, and I was driving through a neighborhood called the Tenderloin. Yeah. And it's a pretty rough neighborhood here in San Francisco. I was late to pick up my children, and my screen was ringing. It was the head school mistress and my wife calling from her business trip in Florida. It was 6:02, and I'm supposed to be there at 6, and they charge you $1 a minute at the school. And so everyone's calling me, and I'm flying through, and I see a yellow light, and I jump on it, and it turns red almost instantly. So I'm like, oh shit. So I slam on the brakes, and I spit stones and dust at the people sitting next to the sidewalk. And there was 3 large men smoking a joint and drinking some beers. And the leader of the triumvirate looks over at me and he says, "Who the fuck do you think you are, white boy?" And I looked out my window because it was open. And I said, I am a douchebag, and I'm sorry. And he laughed so hard, he bent over at the waist and he stamped his big boot a couple times. And he came over and he said, "Dude, that was awesome. You're
great.
awesome." And he shook my hand and we talked for 10 minutes. And it was just like, he's like, "I was going to kick your ass." And I said, "Yeah, I know you were." And so I went back and I called my wife and I said, "Babe, this just happened." And then I told my therapist, like 4 days later, I sat down on the couch and said, "Oh, doc, this happened." And she thought it was a breakthrough. And so that's kind of where it all came from, in the sense that there's some really cool things that take place in your being when you're humble and honest and authentic about who you are. And I was being a douchebag in that moment, because if you took from any vantage point on the street, an overpriced car roaring through a neighborhood and acting like I'm bigger or better and I need to get someplace, and I disrespected these young men, I needed to own that, and I did own that. And so the book after that really talks about, my father was a sociopath, and he did some really bad stuff to me and my brothers. My little brother eventually died from his addiction and depression. And so we wove that into the narrative, and a lot of my insecurities came out. And so I wanted to talk about those insecurities, and I want to do that through a self-deprecating lens, so that other men, specifically my little boys, after they read it, when they're ready to read it, will understand that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be scared. It's okay to admit those things. And then, as I got into the ad industry, as kind of alluded to in the early, before we were on camera, you know, as a pitch guy and a guy who spent a lot of time at conferences and presenting, I was full blown Gucci. I wore black nail polish. I had big hair. I wore eyeliner quite often. I was really into the androgynous David Bowie thing. And, people would come up and say, "Oh my God, you're such a douchebag." And I'd say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not a douchebag. I'm the douchebag." And then they would laugh, and then everything would be. So the idea behind it was just being who you are. And the funny part about it, I think, is that a lot of it stems from spending decades in trying to explain to brands how important it is to be authentic, tell their story. Obviously, I wanted to apply some of that to myself. I think that's where it all came from.
So when you look back, that time that you were covering, was that really a moment of like transformation for you, or was it kind of like, because it seems like you already had the humility piece, even to be able to make jokes like that? Was it a transformation, or just kind of a recap of your general approach of not taking yourself too seriously, not being too prideful, and how to connect with people in a way that's vulnerable? Were you already there, or is this like a sudden transformation?
That's a good question. I think, because this took place in 2014 when I had that moment in the
Yeah.
car. At that moment, in my life, I had accepted the fact that I did not need to take myself so seriously. But
Yeah.
my 20s and 30s, for sure, took myself way too seriously. And I carried these personas with me that proved to be heavy. Personas are like, a suit of armor. They can protect you possibly, but they're heavy. And so taking that off was a long process. And by the time I did get it off fully, it was probably into my 5th decade. So,
So what was your go-to persona?
confidence,
Okay.
arrogance,
Okay.
Someone smarter than me actually said that confidence is the sweet spot between arrogance and despair. Arrogance, believing you have too much ability; despair, not enough. And I think that I used to kind of like flutter around the arrogant side because it made me feel better. And as I went through with my therapist quite often, is that it paid dividends. I had girlfriends, I had success in the business world. And so, why do I want to change? It's working for me. The problem with it, obviously, is if you're really being a jerk, uh, and for me, sometimes I had to get over that. I didn't feel good doing it anymore. It didn't
Yeah.
feel right.
Yeah. And what was your goal, would you say, in writing the book? I guess, well, you did share that you wanted to make sure that your kids had a record to
Yeah.
look to. Was there anything else that you were trying to achieve?
No, sadly, I lost a best friend in a car accident in
Mm,
2017, and his wife asked me if I would deliver the eulogy. And
mm,
so I sat in my mom's house where I grew up, and this was in Minnesota, and I was writing the eulogy, and this was next door to my best friend Jay, who passed. And as I was writing the eulogy, his children were 29 and 19 at the time, 21 and 19, excuse me. And so they knew who their daddy was. He was a wonderful man. He was a doctor and a physician and a thinker and just really sweet and kind and on the church soccer team and just a mensch. And my kids at the time were 6 and 4. And so if the same fate would befall me, my kids wouldn't know who I am, other than my wife saying, "Your daddy loved you so much. He coached your teams." My buddies would be like, "Dude, your dad was so cool. He was this and that," and whatever they wanted to pump me up as. But they wouldn't have known any of my insecurities or any of the fallibility that I kind of needed to explain to them. And as they get older, I think they'll really appreciate it. They can't read it for quite some time, but
How
they're
old are they?
they're 10 and 8 now.
That's great. Well, and what a special thing that you've gotten to give that dedicated time to them.
Yeah, and that was a gift from my wife. My wife is a very powerful executive, and she
Mm,
kind of held down the fort and didn't bitch once and didn't say anything about getting back to work. She made a
mm,
joke after I published the book last April, but she was there, and she always was there because I would get job offers unabated to come and do different things, whether it was to run another agency or to take over a division or do whatever. And she'd always say the same thing: "Did you finish your book?"
mm.
No. And she's like, "Is this your ego?" Yeah.
Yeah.
She's like, "I got this, babe. Finish it." So she was fantastic in this whole process.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. So at some point you started a podcast called Laugh Your Cry Out.
I did.
Now,
And
if
that's a
I
good
look up
segue.
Laugh Your Cry Out, I end up at True 30.
Correct. So
Okay,
that's
so
the
did you
segue.
rebrand? Is that what
We
happened?
did. After
Okay.
I wrote the book, I wanted to talk with people about masculinity and what does that mean and is it being redefined in our culture. And one of the first people I interviewed was a guy named Brian Behar, who is an Emmy award-winning producer for Full House,
Yeah.
and sweet guy. And I didn't know him. I knew him through a mutual friend, and he lost his father to suicide, and he blogs about it and writes about it. And he's just an incredible human being. And so he was my first podcast.
Mm.
And after that, I realized, like, wow, that was heavy and super cool. And then I sat on other podcasts. I sat on some panels to talk about, what is masculinity today moving forward? How does that look? And I was like, this is really neat. I loved this, but it's not what I'm interested in. What am I interested in? And so my family and I rented an RV, and we drove to Austin, Texas, where my wife is from. And her little sister has 4 children under 11.
Mm.
So they're all friends with my little dudes. And so we dropped them off after we got there. And I sat in my mother-in-law's house for the first time in 2 years because I was helping them with their homework as a stay-at-home dad and driving them to soccer practice and didn't have a lot of time to think. I'd write 5 or 6 hours a day, but the rest of it was just taking care of them. And I said to myself, because I talked to myself, if you ever had to work again, what would you do? And the answer was immediate. It was I would read, write, and report on the news media today and why it divides us. And from that moment on, I started interviewing people on major complex topics: safe space on college campuses, critical race theory, defund the police, ideologies in general, and
Yeah.
what that looks like. And so I spent 6 months interviewing professors and academics and thinkers. And it was fantastic. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is it. This is it. And what I did realize, because I didn't dive into the podcast business as a business, it was just a hobby,
Yeah.
is that if I want to do something with it, I need to rebrand it to the point where it is a business. And so I recruited a bunch of buddies from the media world who are now on my editorial board, and some journalists that are helping me research these topics. And so the idea then is, like, we're creating a media company, as you know, that we call is the home of slow journalism. And when I say slow, it doesn't mean that it's just paced slow. It means that there's a methodical way of going about things. There's numerous sources that have to take place. There's no time limit because we have no breaking news. This is not something that we have a typical newsroom. We've got to get a story out. What we actually want to do is marinate on things and do the best we can to explore it from every vantage point. And if you look at history of the things that are dividing our culture today, critical race theory being one of those, defund the police being another. And the reason we started it, and the reason I could recruit some of my friends to do this with me, is that we all genuinely believe that our democracy is in danger. And you talked about this in your opening with your podcast, is what are you doing and how are you helping? Our podcast's goal is to help people understand one another, specific to complex topics, without agreement. It doesn't matter if you agree, but at least you understand things. So an example of which is we did a recent story on Ben Shapiro. And
is he the most powerful person in media? Is he the most
powerful man in news media? Yes, you read it. So we had a reporter dive into that, and I interviewed some media executives that pulled apart the metrics of his media empire. And we talked about the fact that he gets 15 million downloads a month, and then he has 4 million subscribers on YouTube and 4 million subscribers on his podcast. And his company, The Daily Wire, is probably well over $100 million in revenue today. And when this young man has a belief, he's going to spout it to millions and millions of people. And it was funny because I did state on the podcast that I have an intellectual crush on this kid.
Yeah.
And that I think that when he does answer, even when he's in debates, someone will ask a question and it's almost as if Aaron Sorkin wrote his replies for him. And so because I said things like that, I had people unfriend me, block me.
You
DM
lost,
me.
yeah, you're going to lose friends over that.
I lost a lot. And I said, look, I wasn't even saying I agree with the kid. I'm just saying he's a smart young man, and he is in charge of a media empire that is going to possibly shift the midterm elections in November. And that was the idea behind the podcast, was that coupled with another book that we talked about on the podcast was Batya Ungar-Sargon's book, Bad News, which was a ripping read, but it was also a scathing indictment on liberal press, specifically focused on the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New Yorker and things like that. So yeah, I mean, the idea behind what we're trying to do is because we're media folks and because we're journalists, we understand that historical media stories are framed through an either or narrative, very binary. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, there's machine learning and algorithms and things like that. But the polarization of our culture is in part because it's what sells. So if you're a far left person, you watch MSNBC and you'll watch Rachel Maddow. And if you're far right, you'll like Hannity and Tucker and all those folks. And so we actually want to report from the messy middle. And we don't mean that we're middle of the road people, but we want to ask the questions of both sides. And when you do that, it's unpopular and you have to be okay being uncomfortable. And so that's kind of where we at True 30 are attempting to live, if you will.
And so rather than holding others in the media accountable, it appears your goal is to lead by example.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I actually don't believe in ad hominem attacks either. I think that if you don't like an idea, then attack the idea, not the person.
I'm laughing. I don't know how much you know about the Media Roundtable and some of the things we've been doing, but we have 6 values, and one of them is just speak specifically to ad hominem attacks. Like what we're doing is we're just at South by Southwest and unveiled a product that we're launching with a company called Barometer that takes podcasts and uses AI to create risk profiles according to the GARM and 4A's and IAB framework. And then we have our Media Roundtable values that we're starting to work into, and we're actually measuring that sort of thing so that advertisers can be aware of when they're sponsoring these sort of things. So,
That's cool.
You've been on such a parallel path to what we're doing here. It's funny we never met before, like really last week or whatever, but we've been definitely on a very similar journey, trying to push in the same direction. But what's beautiful is we've been doing this for the last couple of years, we keep running into people that have something that they're doing that's different from our approach, but all moving toward the same thing. The funny thing about it is, well, no, I genuinely, I wish someone would do like Lollapalooza for all the people that are working on, um, preserving democracy and getting rid of negative polarization, right? Because I think at this point you probably have observed that not all polarization is bad, and as I understand you, you've really talked about the fact that you are classically liberal, and you do believe in freedoms, and you believe in the value of being able to debate an issue and bring two sides to an argument, which is that's like our whole thing, is we don't want to silence these voices. I think the challenge that we ran into and the conclusion we came to, so I'm just comparing notes with you here, is that the existing options to deal with the problems we're all observing coming out of media, on one side they go, okay, well, we're going to fight, and what we're going to do is we're just going to call out the people that we disagree with, and then you get these online lynch mobs, and depending on what somebody's saying about you on Twitter, you'll lose all your sponsors overnight based on something somebody may have said that you said or misinterpreted. You may have said it or not said it. There's no due process when it comes to things like censorship and what many people call cancel culture. Our problem was that we knew that was a problem, and it was creating what we felt were unjust terminations of relationships with media influencers and publishers. We didn't think that was quite fair. But the problem is, on the other side of the house, you have this rampant, open expression at scale now, where everybody's a journalist, everybody's a reporter, and nobody has any accountability for anything. And that's also very dangerous. So we were kind of stuck in between these two things. And ultimately our conclusion was that, the best thing we can do is roll out the nutrition labels, give people the most objective analysis you can of the content that's out there, and then let them make their own choices with that. But it cannot be partisan. When you see groups like Media Matters or Sleeping Giants, or, there are others, and there are some folks on the right that are now using the same tactics, and they're just throwing stones always in one direction. And I'm sorry, if you're not an equal opportunity accountability bringer, like, get out of my face. There's nothing we can do with you, because we can't trust that you actually are doing the thing that we expect of journalists, which is to be objective, or third parties, which is to be objective. So that was our conclusion. I'm sure there are other ways that we can help bring accountability across media, but I think it's beautiful that what you're doing is you're saying, yeah, I'm gonna let, to each his own, let them be, and just lead by example. I think that's really cool. We're just trying to hit it from like an industry standpoint, and we'll see something. But yeah, what I want to do is if we can get somebody to throw a big party where we can all get together and trade notes and start to collaborate a little bit, we might actually be able to do something with all this.
Yeah, no, I'd be great. I'm good at parties.
Also, you don't have a job, so I'm nominating you to be on the committee for this. At least
is exactly you voiced my wife's opinion. But yeah, I think that's what we're attempting to do, and our proof is in the pudding. So if you look at defund the police as an example, I interviewed some progressive friends who are in the DNC and stated social democrats and communists. They've even used those words. And they wanted to blow up the institution of our judicial system, specifically our police officers. And so I interviewed these young men and women, and I interviewed just last Friday, the episode goes live in, I think, 10 days, the chief of police at Santa Rosa Police Department. And he oversees a staff of 256. 180 of those officers are uniformed peace officers. And he talked at length about what they're doing specifically with defund the police initiatives, and what the conversations that took place on the last 8 months is that when you talk to a social progressive, they say things like, hey, it'd be great if the police didn't have to deal with mental health. They shouldn't be going to all these calls. It would be great if they used their cameras. It would be great if they had PTSD training. It would be great if they had de-escalation training. Why don't they have these? And so you're like, okay, and I'm taking contemporaneous notes, and I'm like, these are all really good points. Thank you, sir. And then you interview the police officers, and they say things like, we need more budget for cameras. We need more budget for PTSD training. We need more budget for de-escalation training. We do not want to be the number one reason people call us is because of mental health. And so this police captain, his name is Captain Cregan. Actually, he's the new interim chief. He said he went through all of the wonderful things that are taking place in the police department in Santa Rosa, specific to mental health, the in-response units, the millions of dollars that is now funneled into de-escalation training, to PTSD training, to social workers, to psychiatrists, to people on the ground that are not uniformed peace officers, to go to calls for specifically mental health reasons. And the numbers are staggering. The bottom of the barrel is 25% of all calls within police departments are mental health related. And for his department specifically, they had 255,000 calls into dispatch in 2019. 137,000 of those calls were calls to service. 235 of those involved use of force. And he said, Joey, that's 0.017% of our calls. And the narrative out there is that police are beating up people every single day, or that they're harming people every single day. And when you actually zoom out on a lot of the narrative, there's 1 million uniformed police officers in the United States today. There's 18,000 police departments. You can't, and yes, there are racist police officers. Yes, there are racist departments. There are even racist cities, right? We know this. But the fact is the narrative itself is poisonous, and it's been dividing our culture for the last since the murder of George Floyd. And then there's other big issues, critical race theory. You look at Terry. Yes, it was Youngkin who won an election in Virginia by saying he was going to remove critical race theory from K through 12 schools as soon as he was elected. And he won. He got a 15-point bump based on that narrative. And the problem with that is that there has never been critical race theory taught to K through 12 in the state of Virginia, or anywhere else for that matter, because critical race theory is taught at the academic level, specifically law school and graduate school, and it's theory offered up by wonderful thinkers like Derek Bell and Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw. And these are not typical discussions that are being taught to my little boys, as an example. And those kind of narratives are not easy to figure out in a six-minute segment on broadcast news or a meme on social media. And then it just divides us further. And that's where we, True 30, are trying to attempt to, if you watch any of our programs, you'll see, an interview with the police captain or a police chief or a social democrat. You can then view and watch and read and discern for yourself what's happening here. And we're about to take on gender dysphoria. That's going to be the next 6 months of our life. We have, people. I'm interviewing a scholar, clinical researcher in Britain next 2 weeks from now, who wrote a best-selling book, and she's been eviscerated in the press for this clinical research as being transphobic and racist and awful. Mm-hmm. And then I'm interviewing second wave feminists, and I'm interviewing a father in the media.
Can you explain second wave feminists?
People like Camille Paglia, Christina Summers Hoff, Suzanne Moore, people who have been lobbying as suffragists for a delineation between genders specific to protecting feminism, right? That's the second wave movement. The third wave movement is now what you see with trans ideology and how that's kind of, intersecting and kind of clouding the waters of a second wave feminist's whole life, to be specific. And so that's why we think they're a very necessary voice to be on the platform. And so these are all topics that are dividing us currently. And then as an example, I was just getting to is that I'm interviewing this guy whose 6-year-old biological boy has been transitioning for 3 years. And he shared pictures of me with me, and she's adorable and she's blissfully happy. And now he and his wife are in this unenviable position of deciding whether they want to use hormone inhibitors and or what's going to happen with her if they do not, specifically testosterone, because once testosterone hits the body, you can't undo that, right? Mm-hmm. And so we like to approach these objectively. And again, I lean one way or another on all these subjects, but the best I can do to get our reporting out there is to have our reporters go do their job, share the information with me, and then as a talking head, I'm interviewing these folks to try, at least attempt to be objective in our reporting and our storytelling at the benefit of our collective culture. Because we just have to stop hating each other. I mean, the fact that we're red and blue, we hate each other just like the Crips and the Bloods used to. And that didn't work, right? And it's even the same colors. We just have to stop with the nonsense. It doesn't, you shouldn't hate someone because they voted for Donald Trump. You shouldn't hate someone because they voted for Joe Biden. And we do. And it has to stop. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, you are preaching to the converted here. I was wondering why you call it True 30, and then I think I didn't see anything written about why, and I have a theory. Should I run my theory by you?
Yeah.
Is it a nod to Section 230?
No, that's a really good point. It's actually in journalism. There's a -30 when you're done with you as a reporter. When you're done with your actual article, you send it up to your publisher with a 30 at the bottom, and they know your editor, and that's when it's ready to go. And so we took True 30 and put it into a name, and the name was written by one of my journalists, and he's a story journalist in his own right, but he came up with the name. So.
Oh, that's interesting. And I never knew that rule before. Not that I'm a
I didn't
professional
either.
journalist.
Yeah.
I'm like you in the advertising side, but no, I was not aware of that. So how far along are you in the endeavor? How big's the team? What are the pieces of it right now?
We just started
it creating on a recurring basis.
Yeah, we just started it. We kicked it off February 11th, and we have an editorial team. Some of the people you know,
wow,
Mark Naples and Kendall Rockwell, and I have buddies from the media space, Kevin Ryan and Jim McCaskis, and my friend David Krakow. So we have a smattering of journalists and writers and thinkers. And what we're proud of, because we're not diverse ethnicity-wise, it's just kind of how it turned out. It was the kickball team that I put together to win the game, and it happened to be all white people. And so my wife makes fun of that all the time. But the idea there is that we have viewpoint diversity, and we have people that are small C conservatives on the team, libertarians, leftists, and liberals and progressives. And the idea there is that the editorial board assesses, are we being objective with the story? And that's the idea, because there's an old saying in Irish, and you've heard this: trust grows at the speed of a coconut tree, and it falls at the speed of a coconut.
Yeah.
And so our idea is we have to continue to be objective in our reporting. And if we don't, if we have one story that goes sideways because it's completely blatantly partisan, it could hurt us. And so we're very careful about how we report on what we're reporting on. And by the way, we're very careful to choose the topics in which we choose, because we're going to work on the same subjects.
I got to say, it seems like you pick all the hardest ones, which I'm impressed by. But yeah.
Well,
it's a delicate thing. Yeah, it's a delicate thing. No, that's wonderful. What do you think are the necessary, what has to happen in society, culture, or just the industry to restore journalism in a broader way across the board? What would need to occur for things to get better, do you think?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that.
Other than people seeing your example and following your example, in addition to that.
Yes. So we actually launched a story today called Life, Death, and Life of American Journalism. And it was an interview we had with a woman named Marcia Parker. And Marcia Parker was the associate dean at the Berkeley School of Journalism, a very popular and storied reporter in her own time. And she's now the chief operating officer of Cal Matters, which is the largest nonprofit news organization in California. And what they do on mission, because they're a nonprofit, is they are not allowed to report partisan news. And because of that, their reporting itself is objective. And by the way, we've kind of referenced this in the article. It can be perceived as boring because their reporters, their beat reporters, will sit in on local legislation. They'll sit in on meetings that probably most people don't want to read about. They talk about voter guides. They talk about things that aren't as sexy as critical race theory or gender dysphoria or whatever's going on in the news today. But currently, they have 1.8 million visitors a month to their website. Because they're a nonprofit, they have about $8 million a year in funding, and they're sharing all of their news with 38 of their reporters with 250 other nonprofit journalistic organizations in the state of California. So they are doing yeoman's work out there, and they're doing it in the non-sexy way. And these are not the reporters that you see on MSNBC or Fox in their fancy clothes. These are people that are actual shoe leather reporting on the beat, doing their job. And the good news, which I'm just learning now in my deep dive into nonprofit news, is that it's growing, and it's growing exponentially. And I think in part it's growing because people really want to know, where can I go to watch or read or absorb nonpartisan news? I just want to know. And they've done some really amazing award-winning articles specifically on nursing homes in California during the pandemic. What's happening with the fires? How are they holding politicians accountable on a $3 trillion California budget? I mean, we're the 5th largest economy in the world, and we have a $300 billion budget to circumvent some of these things. And they have a team of reporters that is attempting in Sacramento to hold our legislators responsible and accountable. And it's fantastic. So the good news is that journalism is not dead. It's growing in certain areas. And the nonprofit news sector itself is a fantastic example of that.
So True 30 is a nonprofit?
No, we're for profit.
Okay. I am too.
Yeah. And we actually, because I am not a reporter. Someone asked me the other day, "Are you a journalist?" I was like, no, I don't. It just bastardizes the word. Journalists are people of specific training, and they've gone to school and they've studied something and they know how to do it. And I can tell you, working side by side with reporters, they are amazing thinkers and writers. And so it's one of those things where I probably should have led with that. But the idea there is, we are for profit, and we are attempting, and I should say this candidly, we are going after topics in the zeitgeist. We're not going after the boring ones. Like, I'm not going to have a reporter down in San Francisco. We did actually report on the SF school board recall, because that was interesting.
Sure.
And it was, misreported by both the left and the right. So we did our best to figure that out.
Well, but I think there's enough headroom in the lane that you're choosing that you can go after. You can play the hits before we have enough market share to get into the more granular. But I hope that's the way it goes, right?
I do
got
too.
This whole epidemic with local journalism, which is a big problem. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're reading my mind, because I have a future business or former business partner who is a ridiculously good journalist. He worked for the UN, and he worked at Patch with Marsha Parker. And he said to me, if this thing takes off and you want to have local beat reporters, I will run them for you. And I was like, buddy, I said, I would love that. I can't afford you yet. He said, he's at a big agency now, but it's one of those things where, I want to build the company out that way. I have long-term vision of this, and I've never been more excited about something, because, as I said earlier, this is exactly what I want to do. I wake up every morning stoked about which story I want to chase, or what book I need to read, or what person I need to get on the podcast. I'm just enthralled every single day.
Well, I feel similarly in that, you can write a list of every major threat, existential or near existential, that we face today. You can write them on a list and realize that there's going to be no progress on any of them if we don't get over the polarization thing. If we can't collaborate, if we can't do business because we're too busy attacking each other all the time, then everything's fucked. So, I hope the world is starting to wake up to the fact that if you care about climate, if you care about racial justice, if you care about anything, you're going to need to get buy-in from people on both sides, or else the issue's not going to improve. So I feel like this is the epidemic. This is the threat that doesn't really, I don't feel like it gets treated like the other ones, but it's the underpinning of them all. So I think, that there's very little that you can do that is more needed right now. I will tell you, though, as I've pitched a million different permutations of this and tried to look at different slices of the ecosystem and, think about where we can fit in. When I talk to the people that own media publications or platforms that have real big pipes and could really bring a lot of exposure to something. You tell them about this stuff, and the reaction is inevitably nobody's going to go for that, because that just means you're going to be less interesting than everything else. Correct. Because the reality is, when you're driving down the street, do you rubberneck at the people that are just talking civilly, or if there's a fight or a car accident, are you going to look at, like, there's humanity, right? And and is it ever possible that doing the right thing in journalism is going to win in a commercial sense over the cheaper alternatives?
I think that's a great point. And I think in part, I have a small C conservative writer that I look forward to reading every single article he writes, because he's angry and he's hilarious. And he wrote an article recently called Cocaine and Waffles. And it was his ode to.
Is that a nice pairing?
Talladega
I don't know.
Nights. Well, it's a Talladega Nights reference. And the idea there was that it's business and politics he doesn't think work. And he referenced Coinbase and Basecamp and a couple CEOs who came out and said, hey, we're done with this. There's no more political discussions on Slack. Yeah. It's taking 60% of our efforts. We see it. It's hurting our productivity. We're done. And then he even gave people severance packages that did not want to work there anymore. And so that was a fantastic story. And we wrote about that story. And to your point, it's not middle. It's not like it's not going to offend people. He did his job to offend people. And that's, part of our internal dialogue is, if we're not offending 30% of the population out there, we're not doing something right. So the goal is just to definitely be opinionated, but to also then have another article about the goodness of politics in the business world. Where does that come from? So you can still be from the messy middle. You just have to point out, hey, that was BS you did over here. And hey, that was BS you did over here. And if you can do that with wit and proper prose and a lot of homework, I think that people will eventually absorb it. To your point, I've had a couple folks from high school, small C conservatives, that listened to the Ben Shapiro episode, shared it with their friends, and we haven't even marketed any of this yet. They shared it I had 500 downloads on that podcast because it got shared within this conservative group. I went to a place called Santa Rosa. I went to high school there. And the majority of my friends are either small C conservatives or Trumpers. I love them all. And I am actually working on bringing them into what we're calling True 30 Insiders as a focus group, because these are people I love and I respect, and they love and respect me. And we don't agree on a lot of stuff. So the idea there is when they said they would share it with friends and then they would talk about it, they were actually talking about this on their own. And they would tweet me and say, hey, I got another subscriber for your Substack, or I did this. And this guy loved you because he said it's cool and liberals rip on liberals. Right. And so it was like, I do think there's a swell there. And
I love when people call bullshit on their own team, right? I got no time for people that want to just do the obvious, right? But
because that's easy.
Show us that you're thinking, or else how do you have trust? No, and I share your optimism that there is a market in the middle. I have a theory that I have not taken the time to try to prove or disprove, but I actually think that, if you're a liberal or if you're a conservative, you're at between the middle of your side and the center. If you're in that 50% center quadrant, you're going to have more in common across the aisle than you will with the extreme positions. And I really feel that the problem is the extreme on both sides is who gets the most attention right now. And because our economy is set up in a way that rewards attention, that they keep winning, and everybody else is kind of like, whoa, wait a second. We actually don't hate these people.
Right.
We're just not being heard. We're being drowned out by the noise. So yeah, it's a mess, but I think there are good examples of where this is starting to be commercially successful. And I think that, I actually think that Ben Shapiro, as an example, people judge him. They don't generally listen to him, but if you listen to him, he is generally what you think, very conservative, but intellectually honest, and will call his own side to account. And I don't care where you are on the spectrum. Hopefully there's something respectable about that. But then there's people like, we had him on the show a couple of years ago, Matthew Iglesias. The name of his newsletter, his Substack, is The Slow Boring. And I mean, he's one of the best thinkers that I know of today. And you don't necessarily know where he is politically. He's on the left, but you wouldn't think that because he's just analyzing things and trying to give informed perspectives. And if we don't have to feel like we can only have an opinion if it mirrors the talking points of the loudest voices in a party, you can actually reach a lot of people and connect with them. But it may not be, I think the fact that you're willing to take this tortoise and the hare approach is really important, because I think if you actually got funding and said, we're going to go and scale our audience, by X% and these benchmarks, and you're trying to do that in the short term, you're not going to be able to do both at the same time. You either have to go slow and steady, or you have to exploit. So,
correct. Yeah, no, that's a good point, because we actually also had that as an edict internally, is that, we're live right now, but we haven't launched. And so when we do launch, whenever that is, after someone reads 10, 12 articles on our platform, we want them to be genuinely confused as to who we're catering to as a political leaning.
That would be super.
And, well, as of right now, if anyone looks, they will see exactly that. And we only have 10 or 12 articles up and 4 or 5 podcasts. But the idea there is that we're not catering to a specific leaning. And that is, we think, crucial to our future growth and why we're doing things. There's kind of an example called One Small Step. And it's a company that actually takes 2 people from different political ideologies and sits them in a room together. It's done by a social scientist. And they actually read resumes to each other. And the resumes would be like you and I would read resumes, but they purposely pick people that have some commonality. You and I obviously would be digital marketing, right? So we'd have that in common. Or you both grew up in Minnesota. And so as you're reading the resume back and forth.
Are you Minnesota?
Yeah, I grew up.
I'm Michigan, but most people think that's the same thing. So
there you go. It's kind of close.
Effectively, yes.
I grew up here. Yeah, exactly. But the idea there is that if you read a resume to somebody and say, I grew up in Minnesota and I went here and I went to high school, and then they read something, they're like, did you go to John Marshall? Yeah, me too. And now let's talk about politics. Did you vote for Donald Trump? I did. Can I ask you why? Yeah, because I really like him. It's not, you're a piece of crap and I hate you and my blah, blah, blah. It's like, it actually brings you back to a human piece of mano a mano. Hey, we have something in common. And from that vantage point, you can actually have a functional discussion about politics. And that's the goal of True 30, is to, again, it's about understanding one another. It doesn't matter if you agree. I don't agree with almost everything Ben Shapiro says politically. Yeah. But I've watched him in interviews. Niall Ferguson, as an example, big thinker. And he had Niall Ferguson on his Sunday. And that was an hour and 20-minute conversation that was polite and highly engaging and very intellectual. And Ben, by the way, in these environments is very calm. He's not as quick on his pacing. He's not at all defensive. He's funny. He's whimsical. And then if you understand him, which I do now, because I've done a couple 100 hours of homework on him, is that, he skipped 2 grades going, because he's highly intelligent, and he entered high school at 5'2" and a $110 with a yarmulke. So, I mean, you don't have to like fill in a bunch of details there to figure out that kid got absolutely mercilessly picked on. And is that part of his mad dog approach today? I have no idea, but there's a corollary thread.
You're getting to know his story, and I think that gives you a different perspective on somebody. And
if you can get the bad person
judgment and the venom out of everything, just listen to people.
Yeah.
Who knows? We might learn something, right?
Well, and I do, right? I learned from him a lot, because out of the 8 things I don't agree with politically, he'll say something and be like, oh, it's a really good point, and it's about understanding him. It doesn't mean I agree with him. And I don't think he's a bad person. I think that we have to stop with that bullshit too. Yeah.
Well, so listen, I want to say thank you for the work that you're doing. What you're doing is really important and very much aligned in what we're trying to do. I'm so excited to see somebody, fighting the same fight just from another angle, right? Yeah. We all need to be rolling up our sleeves in this. And so very grateful for your story and your vulnerability. I don't think you are a douchebag. I'll go on record with that. Yeah, I think we can all be that way from time to time, but I don't experience you that way at all. And I hope that sounds like you are preparing to launch, but don't have a start date yet.
Correct. We're actually slow on that front too.
Well, you're keeping your promise. Slow journalism, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're doing. Please thank your wife for her patience so that you can do this work. Let her know that you have people that are pulling for it. And I hope that you keep in touch with us as you launch this thing. Where would you direct people to engage with you and to get more of this type of thinking?
Our Substack, the True 30 Substack, is the best place to go because that's where our podcasts live and our stories live, where our actual reporters are writing. And then our True 30 website, just if you want to see, kind of the onus of where we started. There's not a lot of functionality on that, but it's true30.com. And those are the two big places to look today.
Thank you, Joey. Really appreciated having you. And we'll keep the conversation going. This show is dedicated to our mission of mobilizing marketers to advance truth and civility in journalism. We value clarity, truth, fairness, respect, de-escalation, and tolerance. And we invite you to connect with us at mediaroundtable.com. Now, if you found the show helpful and you want to participate in the cause, please follow us on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to listen. It's always free. And if you're a marketer looking for support to live this out, you can get in touch with our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, Amy, and the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly.